The moment Owen Hayes crested the ridge above Harlan Creek and saw the woman hauling two iron-banded water buckets across a sheet of glazed ice, her boots slipping and her breath coming in white bursts against the January sky, something inside his chest shifted in a way it had not shifted in a very long time. It was the winter of 1879, deep in the Montana Territory, where the cold was not a nuisance but a living adversary, patient and thorough, and entirely indifferent to human suffering. The town of Harlan Creek sat in a shallow valley between two mountain shoulders, and though it called itself a town, it was really just a collection of ambitions. A general store run by a man named Aldous Briggs who watered down his whiskey and charged double for his flour, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekday mornings, and perhaps 40 souls scattered across homesteads that pressed up against the tree line like frightened animals. Owen Hayes was not a man who belonged to towns. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way that only a life of genuine labor can produce, with forearms roped with muscle from years of felling timber and hauling stone and running trap lines through the high country. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, half wild from months of solitude, and his jaw was covered in a beard that had grown thick and full through the autumn. He stood 6'2" in his elk-hide boots, and when he moved through the wilderness, he moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had learned that nature rewards patience and punishes haste. He had come down from the high country only because his supply of salt was exhausted and his coffee was gone, two deprivations that even the most dedicated solitary man could not long endure. He had not planned to stop. He had planned to ride into Harlan Creek, trade 2 good beaver pelts and a bundle of dried elk meat to Aldous Briggs for coffee and salt and a fresh sack of cornmeal, and ride back up into the mountains before dark. That was the plan. Plans, he had learned a long time ago, had a way of dissolving when the world decided to show you something more important. The woman on the ice was perhaps a quarter-mile below him, moving along the path that cut between the frozen creek and a homestead that sat back from the water by 100 yards or so. The homestead was modest, a log cabin with a good stone chimney pushing smoke into the gray sky, a small barn, a chicken coop, a root cellar dug into the hillside. Someone had worked hard to build those structures, and someone had kept them up with care. But whoever had built them had not solved the problem of water in winter, because the woman with the buckets was clearly making this walk repeatedly, and it was clearly destroying her. Owen watched her for a moment longer than he should have before he pointed his horse, a broad-chested roan gelding named Jasper, down the slope. Her name was Grace Harper, though he did not know that yet. She was 28 years old, and she had been a widow for 14 months, ever since her husband Thomas Harper had ridden out on a clear November morning to check on a calf that had wandered from the pasture and had come home across the back of his horse with a rattlesnake bite already turning his leg black. He had lasted 3 days. Grace had buried him herself, with only her nearest neighbor, a Finnish woman named Marta Lindqvist, to help her dig the frozen ground. Since then Grace had managed the homestead alone. Her son, a boy of 7 named Samuel, helped where his small arms could manage, but the real weight of the place fell entirely on her. She was not a small woman. The frontier had made her strong in the way it made all frontier women strong, but she was built fine through the wrists and fine through the jaw, and when she smiled, which was less often now than it had once been, she had a particular warmth in her dark eyes that made people feel seen. She had dark hair that she kept braided and pinned under a wool cap in winter, and her cheeks were always high with color from the cold and from the effort of keeping her family alive. The problem with the water had started 3 weeks ago when the creek had frozen solid all the way across, and the hole she had been chopping every morning to draw water from had begun to drift over with ice so thick and so fast that chopping it open was taking her nearly an hour each morning before she could even begin hauling. The ice on the path between the water hole and the cabin was treacherous, layered and relayered with each night's freeze, and she had fallen twice already. Once badly enough to bruise her hip so severely that she had limped for a week. But the animals needed water and Samuel needed water, and the cabin needed water, and so she hauled, every single morning and every single evening, back and forth across that glassy killing ground with those iron-banded buckets. Owen Hayes reached the bottom of the slope and guided Jasper along the creek bank until he was close enough to speak without shouting. He pulled up and watched her take another careful step on the ice, both buckets swinging, her whole body tense with the effort of maintaining her balance. She had not heard him approach over the crunch of her own footsteps. "Ma'am," he said. She startled hard enough that one of the buckets swung wide and pulled her sideways, and for a terrible half-second it looked like she was going to go down, but she caught herself with a sharp intake of breath and stood rigid, both buckets held out like a tightrope walker's poles, staring at him. "I did not mean to frighten you," he said immediately, and he meant it. "I saw you from the ridge. That path is dangerous." She looked at him the way frontier women look at strange men who appear from nowhere, not with fear exactly, but with a careful assessment, measuring, weighing. Her dark eyes moved over him, over Jasper, over the traps and pelts tied behind his saddle. "I have been walking it every day," she said. Her voice was clear and direct. "I know it is dangerous." "Yes, ma'am, I can see that you know," Owen said, and something in his tone must have struck her as honest rather than patronizing because her chin dropped just slightly from its defensive angle. "My name is Owen Hayes. I have been running traplines up in the high country. I was riding through on my way to the store." "Grace Harper," she said. She did not offer her hand because both of them were full of bucket handles. "The store is another half-mile along the creek." "I know where the store is," he said. "I have been coming through Harlan Creek for years." She studied him another moment. "Then go to the store, Mr. Hayes." But he had already stepped down from Jasper, and he was already moving carefully along the bank to where the ice met the path, and he was already reaching out both big hands for the bucket handles. She blinked. "I can carry my own water," she said. "I know you can," he said simply. "But you should not have to do it on ice, and you should not have to do it alone. And if you will permit me, I would like to carry these two and then go back for however many more trips you need this morning." There was a pause. The cold wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek and rattled the bare branches together. A crow called from somewhere up on the slope. "2 more trips," she said, and she let him take the buckets. He carried them to her cabin door in a fraction of the time it had taken her to navigate the ice, because he was heavy enough that his boots bit through the glaze and found the ground beneath, and because his arms were strong enough that the swing of the buckets did not throw him off his center. He set them down on the cabin porch and turned back without being asked. On the second trip, he noticed that the water hole in the ice was not in a good position. It was far from the bank, and the ice around it was riddled with the kind of stress fractures that happened when the freeze-thaw cycle opened and refroze old weaknesses. It was also nowhere near the natural slope of the land, which meant whoever had originally chosen the water-drawing spot had not thought about drainage or approach angle. On the third trip, while he was carrying the last 2 buckets up from the hole, he looked at the whole geography of the homestead, the cabin, the creek, the slope of the land between them, with the particular attention of a man who had spent years reading mountain terrain, and something clicked into place in his mind. Grace was standing on the porch when he arrived with the last load, and she had a tin cup of coffee in each hand, which told him something about her character, that she noticed what people did and she responded to it in kind without being asked. "Thank you," she said, and held out a cup. He took it and drank. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter, and it was the best thing he had tasted in 3 months. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "how long have you been hauling water this way?" "Since the creek froze hard," she said, 3 weeks. And before that, there was a pump behind the cabin, but the pipe burst in the first freeze of November. I have not been able to afford the iron to repair it." She said it without apology or self-pity, the way people on the frontier stated facts. He turned and looked at the land behind the cabin. The hillside rose gradually, and there was a spring seep visible in the rocks up on the slope. He could see it because he had been looking at mountain terrain his whole adult life, and he knew what the patterns of ice and vegetation around a seep looked like. "Is that your land up the slope?" he said. She followed his gaze. "As far as the big rock that looks like a seated bear," she said. "Thomas filed the claim in 1874. There is a spring up there," he said. "I can see the seep from here. You know about it." "I know about it," she said. "Thomas talked about using it but never got around to it." Owen Hayes was quiet for a moment. He set the empty coffee cup down on the porch railing and looked at the slope, then at the cabin, then at the spring, calculating. The elevation change was perhaps 60 or 70 feet over a distance of maybe 300 yards. The grade was gentle. The ground between the spring and the cabin was open and workable, even in winter, because it faced south and the sun hit it for most of the day. "I could build you an aqueduct," he said. Grace stared at him. "A what?" "A channel," he said. "A water course. Cut it into the ground, line it with flat stones to prevent seepage, run it from the spring down to a collection basin here behind the cabin. Gravity does the work. No more hauling, no more ice. Water comes to you." She looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between hope and the particular wariness of a woman who had been disappointed too many times by things that sounded easier than they were. "Mr. Hayes," she said carefully, "that sounds like a great deal of work." "It is," he agreed, "but it is the right kind of work. Give me the weekend." "The weekend," she repeated. 2 days, he said, "maybe 3. I have built channels in worse conditions than this." She was quiet for a long moment. The smoke from her chimney rose straight up in the cold, still air. From inside the cabin came the sound of a child's footsteps, and then the door opened and a boy of about 7 appeared, gap-toothed and wearing a coat that was slightly too large for him and looking at Owen with the frank, fearless curiosity that some children have. "Mama, who is that?" the boy said. "Samuel," Grace said. "This is Mr. Hayes. He has been kind enough to help with the water." Samuel looked at Owen with great seriousness and stuck out his hand, in the manner of someone who had been taught that this was what you did when you met a man. Owen shook it without condescension and with appropriate gravity. "You are a very large man," Samuel observed. "Samuel," Grace said in a warning tone. "He is not wrong," Owen said mildly. He looked at Grace. "I need to ride to the store for supplies. I will be back before noon." She opened her mouth, and he could see she was going to say something cautious, something about how he did not have to do this, how she could not ask him to give up his time, all the careful language people use when they want something very much but are afraid to want it. He spoke before she could. "I will be back before noon," he said again, gently but firmly. Then he went to Jasper, stepped up into the saddle and rode toward the store. Aldous Briggs was a narrow man with a narrow mind and narrow opinions about most things, and he watched Owen lay 2 beaver pelts and the dried elk on the counter with the calculating look of a man who was already deciding how little he could offer in return. "Coffee and salt first," Owen said. "And then I need to talk to you about Flat Stone. I know you keep a quarry account with the Swenson brothers up on the North Fork." Briggs raised an eyebrow. "Flat stone is for building." "Yes," Owen said. "That is why I want it. Swensons are not going to be happy about pulling stone in this cold." "They will be happy enough if the price is right," Owen said. "I'm not asking for granite, I'm asking for the flat slate they pull for flooring and pathways. They have a pile of it already cut." Briggs scratched his ear. "What are you building?" "A water channel for the Harper homestead." Briggs looked at him then with a different kind of interest, the kind that preceded gossip. "The Harper widow," he said. "Mrs. Harper, yes," Owen said, and his tone closed that door very firmly. Briggs arranged for the slate delivery through a boy who ran messages between the store and the various homesteads, and Owen spent the rest of his time at the store selecting the things he would need. An extra pickaxe on account of his own having a cracked haft, a length of iron pipe that he could use to create a proper intake at the spring, a bag of wet mix mortar that Briggs kept for foundation work, a coil of rope. He paid for all of it himself, which surprised Briggs into silence, and loaded it onto Jasper and a borrowed mule that Briggs kept for hauling purposes, and charged him 2 bits for the day. He rode back to the Harper place with the mule pulling the heavy load, and he arrived at just past 11 o'clock in the morning to find Grace outside the cabin splitting firewood. She had a good rhythm and a true swing, and she was using a maul rather than a hatchet because she was cutting hardwood and she knew the difference. He liked that about her immediately, that she had learned the tools the right way, without anyone to teach her. She stopped and straightened when she heard him coming, and she looked at the loaded mule with an expression that moved through surprise and into something more complex. "You bought the materials yourself," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "I cannot accept, Mrs. Harper," he said, stepping down from Jasper. "I have been living in a mountain cabin alone for 8 months, and I have more money in salt and pelts than I know what to do with. This is what I want to do with some of it. I'm not asking for anything in return." She looked at him for a long moment, and whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied some internal requirement, because she nodded once firmly and put down the maul. "Then let me help," she said. "You can help," he said, "but first show me that spring." They walked up the hillside together, and Samuel came with them because Samuel was not the kind of boy who stayed in the cabin when interesting things were happening. The slope was firm underfoot where the frost had hardened the ground, and Owen walked with his eyes on the terrain, reading it, while Grace pointed out the features of her land with the quiet pride of someone who had worked every inch of it. The spring was exactly where Owen had thought it would be, a seep from the rock face, currently forming a thin sheet of ice down the stone face, but clearly running under it, because he could hear the faint trickle and feel the slightly elevated temperature of the air just above the rock. He crouched and pressed his hand against the ice and pulled it back. The cold was wet and living, not the dry, dead cold of a freeze with nothing behind it. "This is a good spring," he said. "It is running all winter. See how the ice is thin here and thicker here. The flow is regular." Grace crouched beside him. She was close enough that he could smell wood smoke in her hair and something faintly sweet that might have been lye soap or might have been something she used to keep her skin from cracking in the cold. He was aware of her nearness with a precision that surprised him, given how long he had been out of the company of other people. "How do we start?" she said. "We trace the line first," he said, standing. He walked down from the spring, taking the natural fall of the land, marking the root with his eye and occasionally pressing the toe of his boot into the earth to test the ground's composition. The soil was good, not too rocky, not too loose. The grade was consistent. He stopped at a spot behind the cabin that sat naturally lower than the surrounding ground. "The basin goes here," he said. "I will cut a hole about 4 feet square, line it with stone, let the water collect. Then you can draw from it with a bucket on a short rope, or eventually I can run the pipe from the basin into the cabin itself." "Into the cabin," Grace said. She looked at him with an expression he could not quite interpret. Thomas always talked about doing that someday. The way she said Thomas's name, quiet and real, without theater, told him more about their marriage than any long explanation could have. She had loved her husband. The grief was real and ongoing, not a performance. He respected that. He did not try to fill the silence that followed with anything. He went to work. The first thing he did was build a small fire near the base of the spring face to soften the frozen ground around the intake point. And while the ground thawed, he used the pickaxe to begin cutting the channel line, working his way down the slope in long, steady strokes. It was hard work even for a man of his strength. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep in places, and he had to chip and break and pull before he could dig. He took off his coat after 20 minutes because the work was generating heat faster than the cold could take it away, and Grace watched him from the corner of her eye while she split more firewood nearby, and Samuel sat on a rock and provided running commentary. "That is very hard work," Samuel said. "Yes," Owen agreed. "My papa used to do hard work," Samuel said. "He was not as big as you. Your papa sounds like he was a good man, Owen said. He was, Samuel said. He is dead. I know, Owen said. I am sorry for it. Samuel was quiet for a moment, turning a stick in his hands. Mama cried for a long time, he said. She does not cry as much now, but sometimes I hear her at night. Owen stopped chopping and looked at the boy. Samuel met his eyes with the particular directness of children who have grown up too fast. Then she is lucky to have you close by, Owen said. Samuel considered this. I think so, he said with great seriousness, and went back to turning his stick. By midday Owen had the channel roughed out for about a third of its length, a trench about 8 inches wide and 6 inches deep, running in a gentle fall from the spring toward the cabin. Grace brought him food at noon without ceremony, salt pork and cornbread and a tin cup of coffee, and they sat on a fallen log on the hillside and ate, and for a while neither of them spoke, which was its own kind of conversation. Where did you learn to do this? She said eventually. Building water channels. My father built one in Colorado when I was about 12, Owen said. Different scale, he was feeding a mill race, but the principle is the same. Water wants to flow downhill, you just give it a path. Your family was in Colorado. My father's homestead, yes, up in the San Juan Mountains. He came out in 1851 when I was 4 years old. He was a hard man and a good builder. He paused. He died in 1868. The claim went to my older brother when I was 21. I came north. And you have been in the mountains since. More or less, he said. I had a claim of my own for a while near Missoula, but it ran out of promise and I let it go. The trapping pays well enough. I like the solitude. He said it honestly, and then he paused because it no longer felt entirely true, sitting on this log on this slope with this woman beside him. Or I liked it well enough, he amended. She looked at him. That is an interesting correction, she said. Is it? He said. It is, she said, and there was something in her voice that might have been the very early beginning of warmth. They went back to work. By late afternoon he had the channel cut the full length, 280 yards from the spring face to the basin site. It was a clean line, following the natural contour of the land, and he was satisfied with it. He began laying the flat slate as fast as the Swenson boy delivered it. The delivery came at 3 o'clock, 2 flatbed boards loaded with the gray-blue stone he had ordered, and he paid the Swenson boy $1 extra for the fast delivery, and the boy rode back up the North Fork Road looking pleased with himself. Grace worked alongside him without being asked, learning the system, quickly lifting the slate pieces while he mixed the mortar, holding each piece while he set and leveled it, moving to the next section while he made sure the grade was correct. She had good hands, strong and precise, and she learned the rhythm of the work in an hour. Samuel, eventually sent inside for supper, argued about it for a brief period before accepting his fate, and Grace came out after she had fed him and returned to work by lamplight for another hour until Owen told her firmly that there was enough done for the first day and that she needed to sleep. You need to sleep too, she said. I will, he said. He was spreading his bedroll in the barn, which she had offered and he had accepted, and which was warm enough with the animals inside. There is a spare room in the cabin, she said. And then the way she said it, she must have realized how it sounded because color rose in her cheeks even in the lamplight. I mean, for propriety's sake it is perhaps better. The barn is fine, he said easily, sparing her. I have slept in worse, she nodded quickly. I will have breakfast ready at first light. She went inside. He listened to the cabin door close and stood for a moment in the dark and the cold, looking up at a sky that was hammered full of stars, and felt something he had not felt in years and did not quite have a word for. It was something that lived in the chest, adjacent to hope. He slept deeply and woke before dawn, and was already at work on the spring intake, by the time the first gray light came over the ridge. The intake was the most technically demanding part of the project. He needed to capture the spring flow cleanly, direct it into the channel without losing too much to seepage, and create enough head pressure at the start of the channel to keep the water moving all the way down to the basin. He used the iron pipe he had purchased, driving it into the rock face at the point where the seep was strongest. using a 3-pound hammer to drive it through a crack in the stone that the freeze-thaw cycle had already opened. The pipe went in cleaner than he expected, 18 inches deep, angled slightly downward, and when he released the fire he had been keeping near the face to keep the ground workable, water began to trickle from the pipe's end within minutes. He held his hand under it and felt the steady cold pulse of mountain water, and he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. By mid-morning Grace was beside him again, and Samuel was permitted to watch from a dry rock, but not to help because the tools were dangerous and the ground was uneven. Grace carried water for the mortar mixing herself, back and forth from the bucket she kept near the cabin, and Owen noticed that she always took the heavier load and never asked him to take it from her. And he also noticed that she would occasionally stop and press the heels of her hands against the small of her back when she thought he was not looking. "You are hurting your back," he said without looking up from the section of channel he was laying. "I am fine," she said. "You are not," he said. "Let me carry the water for mixing. You have work to do." "The mortar is easier than what I was just doing," he said patiently. "Let me take the water carrying for a while." She was quiet for a moment and then she let him, and he could tell from the way her whole posture softened slightly that her back had been bothering her for quite some time and she had been carrying it in silence. "You are very observant," she said. "I spend a lot of time alone watching things," he said. "You learn to read what you see. What else have you noticed?" She said, and there was something carefully light in her voice, the tone of someone testing the waters. He thought about it. "I noticed that you keep the axe sharp," he said, "which means you have been thinking about the wood supply for a while, not just reacting to the cold. I noticed that the chicken coop has a double wall on the north side, which means you or your husband understood the wind patterns here. I noticed that you do not let Samuel see you tired, but you are tired, and have been for a long time." She was quiet for a long moment. "That last one," she said quietly. "Yes, that is the loneliest kind of tired," he said. She did not answer, but he heard her draw a breath that was slightly unsteady, and he did not look at her because she would not want him to see it, and he respected that, and the moment passed into the work, and they were both the better for not having to look at each other during it. By the end of the second day the channel was fully lined, the intake pipe was set, the mortar was beginning to cure in the sections where he had worked first, and the basin behind the cabin was excavated and waiting to be lined. The water was already flowing, a thin thread at first, picking its way down the lined channel, finding the grade, gathering confidence as it went. By late afternoon, there was a clear, steady stream of water running from the spring down the hillside, following the path Owen had made for it, and it reached the unfinished basin at the bottom and spread across the frozen earth in a widening shimmer. Samuel went absolutely wild with delight when he saw the water arrive. He ran along the channel path and back again 3 times, narrating each of the water's achievements to anyone who would listen. Grace stood at the bottom of the channel near the basin site and watched the water come, and her face did something that Owen was watching carefully from a few yards away, and what her face did was open, just slightly, in the way a face does when something it had stopped hoping for actually arrives. She put her hand down and let the water run over it, and it was cold enough that she gasped slightly and pulled her hand back. And then she laughed, a short, genuine, surprised laugh, and looked up at him. "It works," she said. "Of course it works," he said, and then he smiled, and it must have been the first time he had smiled at her directly because she blinked as though the light had changed. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "Owen," he said, "please." A pause. "Owen," she said, and the way she said it was careful and new, like she was testing the weight of it. I do not have the words for what this is." "It is a water channel," he said, but gently. "It is more than that," she said. "You know it is more than that." He knew. They lined the basin the 3rd morning, which was a Sunday, and it took the full morning because Owen wanted the basin walls to be solid and the floor to be level, and he was not willing to rush it. Grace worked beside him with the efficiency and stamina of someone who had never been allowed to be anything other than capable, and they moved through the work in a rhythm that had developed over 2 days into something almost musical, anticipating each other's needs, handing tools without being asked, communicating with fewer and fewer words because fewer and fewer were needed. The minister from the church schoolhouse, a dry, reedy man named Pastor Holloway, walked up the path to the Harper place at about 10 o'clock that morning with a proprietary expression and an air of having been sent, and he stood at the edge of the work area and watched Owen lift a piece of slate that weighed at least 80 pounds as though it were a piece of kindling, and he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "I see you have acquired a laborer." Grace straightened and looked at the pastor with a level expression. "Mr. Hayes has been kind enough to build a water channel for the property," she said. "I believe I mentioned it to Marta Lindqvist, who I expect told half the valley." Pastor Holloway looked at Owen with the particular combination of suspicion and envy that small men often direct at large ones. "And your connection to this family is what, exactly, Mr. Hayes?" Owen set down the slate and turned around to look at the pastor. He did not do it in a threatening way. He simply looked at the man with a calm, measuring attention that seemed to make the pastor uncomfortable without Owen doing anything deliberate to create that effect. "I saw a woman carrying water across dangerous ice alone in winter," Owen said. "I helped. That is the connection." The pastor worked his mouth for a moment. "Well," he said, "it is somewhat irregular for a single man to be staying at." "Mr. Hayes is staying in the barn, Pastor Holloway," Grace said pleasantly, "as you are welcome to inspect and confirm. Now if you will excuse us, we have a basin to finish." The pastor left with less dignity than he had arrived with, and Owen turned back to his work, and he thought he heard Grace make a very small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. But when he looked at her, she was bent over the basin with a perfectly composed expression. "You have done that before," he said. "Sent pastors away. Once or twice," she said. "Good," he said. They worked through the rest of the morning and into early afternoon, and when the basin was finished and the mortar set enough to trust, Owen blocked the channel at the intake and diverted the flow back around the pipe, so the new mortar could cure for 24 hours before taking the full pressure of the spring. This was the patient part, the part that required waiting, and it was harder in some ways than the physical work had been. Grace made a proper dinner that afternoon, a stew with dried beans and salt pork and some root vegetables from the cellar, and cornbread cooked on the stove top, and there was dried apple preserves that she opened as though it were an occasion, which it was. They sat at the table in the cabin, Owen and Grace and Samuel, and the warmth of the stove and the smell of the food and the particular quality of the light through the low window made something in Owen's chest ache in a way that was not painful, but was very close to painful. Samuel told Owen about his teacher, a woman named Miss Aberdeen, and about the horse that one of the Swenson brothers had, which Samuel considered to be the finest horse in the territory. He asked Owen approximately 14 questions about trapping and mountain living, each one following hard on the answer to the previous, and Owen answered all of them with full seriousness, the way you answer a person, not a child. Grace watched the two of them and said less than she might have, and Owen noticed that she was watching them with an expression that was very difficult to look at directly. After dinner, while Samuel was put to bed, Owen sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee and watched the dark hillside where his water channel was lying in the cold, waiting. The stars were out again. Somewhere up in the timber, a great horned owl was working. The temperature was dropping hard and his breath came in long, slow plumes. He heard the door open behind him and Grace came out with her own cup and sat beside him on the steps, close enough that her shoulder was 6 inches from his arm, and they both looked at the stars for a while. "He likes you," she said. "He is a good boy," Owen said. "He is very like his father," she said, curious about everything, never afraid of hard questions. "Thomas must have been a fine man," he said. "He was a good husband," she said carefully. "He was not always easy. But he was faithful and he worked hard and he loved Samuel very much." She paused. "I was 20 when we married. I did not always choose well at 20, but I do not regret it. He gave me Samuel and he gave me this land. A pause. He tried. Owen said nothing. He understood the particular honesty of what she was offering, not a performance of grief or a revision of it, but the real thing, complicated and true. And you, she said, was there ever anyone? Once, he said. A woman in Missoula. She was the postmaster's daughter, very fine, very sensible. She waited 3 months for me to come back from a trapline, and when I came back she told me very kindly that she could not spend her life wondering if I was dead. She was right. She married someone else. Within the year. A merchant, I think, steady. Indoors, he smiled slightly. It was the right thing. And you were not heartbroken. He considered this honestly. I was sad for a while, he said. But I think what I was sad about was the idea of her and what I might have had, not quite her specifically. He paused. I have never been very good at that, at letting someone become specific to me. She turned her head and looked at him, and he looked back, and in the lamplight from the window and the starlight from overhead, she was very clear and very close and very real. And now? She said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. The owl called again, farther away. I think something is becoming very specific to me, he said. She held his gaze for a long beat and then looked back at the stars, and he could see the line of her jaw and the way she swallowed and the way she held her coffee cup in both hands as though she needed something to hold. You will ride back up into the mountains when this is finished, she said. It was not quite an accusation and not quite a question. That was the plan, he said. Plans have been changing on me lately. She did not answer, but she shifted her weight slightly on the step, and her shoulder came to rest against his arm, just barely, just the warmth of contact through their winter coats, and neither of them moved to change it. And they sat that way in the cold and the starlight until the coffee was gone, and then sat a little longer than that. The next morning he removed the block from the intake pipe and let the spring run free into the channel, and the water came down the slope in a clear, steady stream that ran without faltering all the way to the basin, where it arrived and filled it with the patient industry of water that finally has somewhere to go. Owen stood beside the basin and watched the level rise, and when it reached the overflow mark he had built into the stone wall, the excess trickled away down the drainage channel he had cut to carry it safely to the lower ground below the property. It worked perfectly. Grace stood beside him and watched, and he stood beside her and watched, and for a moment neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. The water was there. It would be there tomorrow. It would be there through the rest of the winter and into the spring and all the springs after it, running clean and cold and reliable from the mountain through the stone channel to the basin behind the cabin, always there, never requiring her to carry it across the ice. I will never be able to repay this, she said. There is nothing to repay, he said. Owen. His name and her voice had changed over 3 days from careful and new to something warmer and more settled. Stop being so straightforward and let me thank you properly. He turned to look at her. She was looking up at him with her dark eyes very direct and her chin lifted slightly, and she looked like someone who had made a decision. Thank you, she said. This is the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me. He held her gaze. It is the most I have wanted to do anything in a long time, he said. She pressed her lips together briefly as though containing something. What will you do now? She asked. I need to go back to the mountain, he said. I have traps to check. A cabin that will need work before the snow gets heavier. She nodded, looking down at the water in the basin. Her jaw was composed and her posture was composed, and he knew she was doing the thing she had gotten very good at, which was managing her face. But, he said, and she looked up, the traps will take a week, and my cabin is not going anywhere, and I have been thinking about that pipe installation running the water line directly into your cabin. That would require a second trip. Something moved in her face. A second trip, she said. If it would be welcome, he said. It would be welcome, she said. The directness of it was unexpected. He could tell by the way she blinked after she said it, as though she had surprised herself. Then I will be back in a week, he said. She nodded. He went to the barn and gathered his bedroll and his tools, and she walked with him around the front of the cabin to where Jasper was tied, and Samuel came running out of the cabin door without his coat on, and had to be intercepted and wrapped back in it before he could say his goodbye, which he then did with great solemnity and a handshake that Owen returned with matching gravity. "You will come back," Samuel said. It was not quite a question. "I will come back," Owen said. "Good," Samuel said, and went back inside, satisfied. Owen mounted Jasper and looked down at Grace from the saddle. She was standing with her hands in her coat pockets and her face tipped up to him and the wind moving a strand of dark hair across her cheek. "1 week," he said. "1 week," she said. He rode out of the yard and up the slope and did not look back, though it cost him something not to. He came back in 5 days. The traps had not needed a full week, and the cabin had not needed anything more than banking the coals and leaving the shutter latched. And if he was honest with himself, he had spent 2 days on the mountain thinking almost exclusively about the small homestead in the valley below. And on the 3rd morning he had made his decision and packed his tools and come back down. Grace opened the cabin door before he had finished tying Jasper to the porch rail, which told him that she had heard his horse and come quickly and that she had done it without stopping to wonder if she should. And when she saw it was 5 days instead of 7, something crossed her face that she could not quite hide, a brightness that came up and would not be managed back down. "It has only been 5 days," she said. "The traps were cooperative," he said. She said, and she was not at all deceived, and they both knew it. He spent the next 3 days on the pipe installation, which was more complicated than the channel had been because it required cutting through the cabin wall without compromising the structural integrity of the logs, fitting a section of pipe that would run from the basin collection point through the wall to a stone sink basin he built inside by the kitchen hearth, and rigging a simple shut-off plug that Grace could open or close as needed. Samuel helped with the interior work, holding the lamp in precisely the right position for extended periods, with the kind of intense concentration that children devote to tasks they feel are genuinely important. But the work was not the center of those days. The work was the frame, and what was inside the frame was Owen and Grace, talking in the hours between the active parts of the work, talking over meals, talking on the porch steps in the evenings with the cold pressing in and the fire visible through the window glass behind them. They talked about the land and what she hoped to make of it, about whether Samuel showed promise in the schoolhouse, about the territorial politics that were shifting constantly as the government made decisions about the railroad and the land grants and the future of places like Harlan Creek. They talked about Owen's years in the mountains, what he had seen, what he had learned, what he had missed. They talked about books she had 4, which was more than most people in the territory, and she had read each of them so many times she could quote long passages, and about the nature of solitude and whether it was a thing chosen or a thing that happened to you. "I think it can be both," Owen said one evening. They were inside that night because a wind had come up, and he was sitting in the chair by the fire that he suspected had been Thomas's, not because she had said so, but because of the small particular way she watched him sit down in it, the first night he had sat there, as though she were measuring something. Sometimes you choose it because you cannot face the alternative, and then after a while it becomes who you are and you do not know how to undo it. "And now," she said. She was mending a shirt of Samuel's by the lamp, and she had her needle threaded between her fingers, and she was looking at him rather than the sewing. "Now I am sitting in a warm room with a lamp burning and someone across from me, and it does not feel like what I thought solitude felt like," he said. She set the mending down. "Owen," she said. "Grace," he said. The fire snapped, and a log shifted and sent up a shower of sparks behind the iron grate, and the wind outside pressed against the cabin walls, and the lamp between them threw its warm, unsteady light, and Owen Hayes looked at Grace Harper and everything he had been carrying in the mountains alone for years, the particular ache of it, the weight of choosing to be alone rather than being unable to have something different. It all presented itself clearly to him, not as suffering but as contrast. "Look at this. Look at how different this is. Look at what you have been without. I do not want to go back to the mountains, he said. Not the same way. She was very still. What does that mean? She said, it means that I have been coming down the mountain my whole adult life to get supplies and going back up, he said, leaning forward in the chair with his elbows on his knees. I have never wanted to stay at the bottom before. I want to stay at the bottom now. Here, she said carefully. If there is any possibility of here, he said. I know it is fast, and I know I am a rough kind of man, and I know you have been through enough that you do not need a complicated situation. But I also know that I have not felt the way I feel sitting in this room in a very long time, and I would rather say it plainly than wonder about it. Grace was quiet for what felt like a very long time. The mending was still in her hands, and she was looking at it but not seeing it. My neighbor Marta Lindqvist, she said finally, told me last autumn that I would know when the right one came along because I would stop being tired. She has a gift for saying things that sound ridiculous until they are true. She looked up at him. I have not been tired, she said, since the first morning you carried those buckets. He stood up from the chair and crossed to where she was sitting and crouched down so he was at her level. And she looked at him with those dark eyes that were very steady and very clear. And he said, Grace, would you let me court you properly? I know that means time, and I know it means doing this the right way, and I am prepared to do it the right way. She reached out and put her hand against his jaw, her palm against the beard, and looked at his face for a moment with a gravity and a tenderness that was so open it almost undid him. Yes, she said. Owen Hayes, yes. He turned his face slightly into her hand and closed his eyes for one moment, and then opened them. And there, it was between them, the start of it, the real beginning of something that had actually been building since that first morning on the ridge when he had seen her carrying water across the ice, and something in his chest had shifted. Aldous Briggs told the whole valley about the mountain man courting the Harper widow within 24 hours of learning about it, which meant that the whole valley knew by the end of that week. Opinions were varied. Marta Lindqvist, when Grace came to tell her herself, took both of Grace's hands in her large rough ones and said something in Finnish that Grace could not translate but understood perfectly from the expression on Marta's face. Pastor Holloway continued to be irregular about the whole situation, but since Owen had taken to attending Sunday services with Grace and Samuel, and sitting in the third row with his big shoulders taking up considerably more than one person's worth of pew, the pastor had moderated his commentary somewhat. Owen had returned to his mountain cabin long enough to gather his things and make arrangements. There was a trapper named Beaumont who worked the same high country, and who was glad to take over Owen's primary trapline for the rest of the winter in exchange for a portion of the proceeds. Owen kept one short line that he could work in a day's ride from the valley, which gave him income and kept his hand in the work he knew, but freed him from the weeks-long absences that would have made a real life below the tree line impossible. He built a small addition onto Grace's cabin over the next 6 weeks, a proper workshop, and a back room for storage. Using lumber he hauled from the Swenson mill, and stone he quarried himself from the hillside above the spring. He was careful throughout all of it to let Grace lead the pace of things, to be present without being presumptuous, to make his intentions very clear while honoring the fact that she was a woman with a son and a homestead, and a life that did not need to be overwhelmed by a large, determined man. She was not a woman who needed managing. She was a woman who had been doing the managing herself for a long time and who wanted a partner, not a protector. Or rather, she wanted both, but in the right proportions, and Owen learned the proportions over those weeks with an attention that she noticed and appreciated. Samuel, for his part, had decided within the first week that he approved of Owen unconditionally, and had shifted his considerable capacity for hero worship in Owen's direction, with a completeness that was both touching and occasionally inconvenient. He had taken to following Owen around the property and asking questions at a rate that would have exhausted most men, and Owen endured it and answered each question without shortening his explanations. And Grace watched them from the kitchen window, sometimes, with an expression that she had stopped trying to contain. In late March, when the snow was beginning to lose its authority on the south-facing slopes, and the creek had opened up in places, Owen rode into Harlan Creek and had a conversation with Aldous Briggs that had nothing to do with pelts or supplies. He emerged from the store with a small item wrapped in a square of calico, which he carried in his breast pocket for 3 days while he determined the right moment. The right moment, it turned out, was an evening in early April when the last of the winter ice had finally surrendered, and the creek was running open and clear and loud, and Grace had taken to sitting on the porch after supper on the evenings that were warm enough to allow it. Samuel was inside with his schoolbook, working on letters by lamplight, and Grace was sitting in the rocker that Owen had built for her over a series of evenings. The first piece of furniture he had made in years, and not his finest work, but solid and comfortable. Owen sat on the porch step with his back against the post, and his legs stretched out and looked at the darkening sky over the ridge. And after a while, he reached into his breast pocket and took out the calico-wrapped object and held it out to her without saying anything. She looked at him and then at the object and then back at him, and then she unfolded the calico, and inside was a ring, not fine jewelry, not a jeweler's ring, but a ring he had made himself from a piece of silver he had been carrying for years in the form of a small ingot, hammered and shaped into something round and smooth, and fitted with a pale blue piece of turquoise he had been carrying since Colorado, since his father's country, since before he knew why he had kept it. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a long time. "I know it is not a proper," he began. "It is exactly proper," she said. Her voice was rough at the edges. "Owen." "Grace Harper," he said, and he turned from the railing to face her properly. "I came down off a mountain and saw you on the ice, and everything changed. That is not a thing I planned, and it is not a thing I can explain. But I know it is real, and I know I do not want to go a single day without being close to you. I would like to marry you, if you will have a rough kind of man who is better with stone and timber than with elegant words." She stood up from the rocker and stepped down the single porch step and stood in front of him where he was sitting, and she took his face in both her hands the way she had done that first night inside by the fire, and she said, "I have had elegant words. I want honest ones." He took the ring from her palm and slipped it onto her finger, and she looked at it there, and then she looked at him, and she bent down and kissed him, and the kiss was unhurried and warm and full of everything that had been building since that first morning on the ice, and the spring evening settled around them as though it had been waiting. They were married in June of 1879 in the church schoolhouse in Harlan Creek, with Pastor Holloway presiding in his most dignified manner and looking, despite himself, not entirely unhappy. Marta Lindqvist sat in the front row and wept freely and translated nothing for anyone but communicated everything. The Swenson brothers came and brought their wives and occupied most of the back 2 rows. Aldous Briggs came and was on his best behavior because Grace Harper had been buying supplies from him for 5 years, and the Harper account was one of his most reliable. Samuel stood at the front of the church beside Owen, who had asked him formally and specifically if he would stand with him at the ceremony, and Samuel had agreed with a solemnity that had lasted all the way until the moment Grace appeared at the back of the church in her best dress, which was blue wool, and then Samuel had turned to look at her, and his composure had cracked into a grin that he was unable to manage for the rest of the ceremony, and nobody held it against him. Owen in his best shirt, which Grace had washed and pressed and which fit tight across his shoulders, because his best shirt was not quite built for his particular architecture, stood at the front of the church and watched Grace walk toward him and felt, very clearly and without any ambiguity, that everything he had ever moved toward or away from in his 32 years had been moving him in this direction, and the rightness of it was complete and calm and enormous. They said the words. He meant every one of them. The summer that followed, was the kind that people who live through it spend the rest of their lives measuring other summers against. Owen worked the homestead with Grace, learning the rhythms of it, the garden that Grace managed with fierce efficiency, the cattle that Thomas had started and that Grace had maintained through the terrible winter, the chickens and the root cellar and the particular negotiations of a homestead that must be almost entirely self-sufficient. He brought his mountain knowledge to it, his understanding of game and weather and terrain, his ability to read the land in ways that translated to practical advantages, knowing where to shelter the cattle when the wind shifted north in September, knowing which stands of timber could be cleared for firewood without destabilizing the hillside. And Grace brought her knowledge to him, the knowledge of a woman who had learned this specific piece of ground over 5 years of marriage and a year and a half of widowhood, who knew where the soil ran thin and where it ran deep, who knew that the south pasture flooded in late April every year and needed drainage, who had been thinking about improvements and additions and the long future of the place without ever having a partner to think about them with. Together they were, in practical terms, considerably more than the sum of 2 people. Owen also found that he was not, as he had sometimes wondered, entirely unsuited to community life. The men of Harlan Creek, the farmers, the stockmen, the few craftsmen who kept the town's mechanisms running, responded to a man who worked hard and talked straight and did not posture, and Owen found himself integrated into the social fabric of the valley in a way that did not chafe him. He was still a man who needed the mountains, who rode up into the high country twice a month to run his line and to breathe the cold air above the tree line and remind himself of who he was. But he came home from those rides with new urgency and a kind of gratitude for the warm window he could see from the ridge, the small, reliable light of it in the early dark. In the autumn of 1879, Grace told him early one morning before Samuel was up, quietly and with her hands folded on the kitchen table and her eyes bright, that she was expecting. Owen sat down across from her at the table with the careful deliberateness of a man who needs to sit down. "Are you is everything?" he said. "I am perfectly well," she said, laughing slightly. "Owen." "Good," he said. "Good." He put his large hands flat on the table and breathed. "Good," he said a third time. She reached across and put her hand over his. "Say something else," she said. "Any word you like." "I am going to be a father," he said. "Yes, you are," she said. "Samuel," he said. "I have thought about that," she said. "Samuel has been thinking about it too, actually. He asked me last week if we were going to have a baby. I did not ask him what gave him the idea." "He is an observant child," Owen said, still sitting very still. "He takes after someone," she said. Owen stood up from the table and came around it and took her gently but completely in his arms and held her, and she put her face against his chest, and he rested his chin on top of her head, and they stayed that way for a while in the early morning in the kitchen, with the coffee cooling on the stove and the autumn sun coming through the east window. He told Samuel that evening, sitting with the boy on the porch after supper. Samuel listened with his hands in his pockets and his feet swinging from the step, processing the information with the lateral seriousness he brought to all major developments. "So there will be a baby," Samuel said. "Yes," Owen said. "That will be a lot of noise," Samuel said. "Babies generally are," Owen agreed. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We will not know until it arrives," Owen said. Samuel thought about this. "I would like a brother," he said, "but if it is a sister I will not complain." "That is very fair-minded of you," Owen said. Samuel nodded and appeared to consider the matter settled. "Will you still take me fishing when the baby comes?" he said. "I will absolutely still take you fishing," Owen said. "In fact, eventually we can take the baby fishing too." Samuel brightened at this. "Can the baby fish?" he said. "Not right away," Owen said. "Babies are not coordinated enough for fishing for the first year or two." Samuel said, filed this away, and went back to his foot swinging. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the gentlest winter the valley had seen in years, which Grace said was the mountains being polite for the occasion, and Owen did not contradict her because he liked the idea of it. The aqueduct performed without fault through the coldest weeks, the channel covered now with a simple wooden shelter he had built over the most exposed sections to prevent ice formation. Water arrived at the basin every morning clear and cold and reliable, and Grace never once in that winter went to the creek with a bucket. The baby arrived in May of 1880, in the first real warmth of spring, a boy, large through the shoulders in a way that the midwife, a competent woman named Mrs. Dolly who had delivered approximately half the children in the valley, said was the most emphatic infant she had seen in several years. Owen sat with Grace through it all, holding her hand and being as useful as a large man in a small cabin can be during labor, which is to say he was useful mostly by being entirely solid and not panicking, which Grace told him afterward was considerably more valuable than it sounded. They named the boy James Thomas Hayes, and the middle name was Grace's idea, and Owen had agreed immediately, because Thomas Harper had built the land and deserved to be remembered in it. James Thomas Hayes was, from his first hours, alarming in his energy. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's dark eyes, and an apparent ambition to make himself heard that he pursued with complete dedication. Samuel, for all his stated neutrality about the gender of the baby, took one look at his new brother and was so immediately and unconditionally devoted that he had to be gently but firmly reminded that babies required sleep, and that hovering over the crib was not helpful. Owen held his son on the first evening of James's life while Grace slept, sitting in the rocking chair by the fire with the boy's weight in the crook of his arm, the small face impossibly detailed in the firelight, and he sat there for a long time, not thinking about anything particular, just present in the fullness of it. The years that followed moved with the particular quality that happy years have. They did not slow down exactly, but they had texture and warmth, and the kind of accumulated meaning that makes them feel larger in memory than in the passing. The homestead grew. Owen filed a formal extension of the land claim in 1881, adding the slope above the spring to the property, and he terraced the lower portion of that slope into a proper kitchen garden that tripled Grace's growing capacity. He built a second barn and fenced a lower pasture, and bought 3 additional cattle to add to the existing stock. He hired on a young hand named Pete Vasquez, a Mexican-American man of 20 who had come up from Santa Fe following the cattle trade, and who was the finest natural horseman Owen had ever seen, and who was also excellent company, and taught Samuel card tricks that Owen pretended to disapprove of and was secretly impressed by. Grace managed the household accounts with a precision that kept the homestead consistently solvent even in the years when beef prices dropped or the garden came up short, and she opened a small trade in preserves and root vegetables with Aldous Briggs, who, faced with the prospect of losing the Harper account, had become considerably more fair in his pricing, that provided a supplementary income through the winter months. Harlan Creek itself grew slowly over those years, as the territory moved toward statehood and the railroad inched closer, and the surveyors came through more frequently. New families arrived. A proper doctor settled in the town in 1882, a young man named Dr. Whitfield, who had come from Ohio with his wife, and had the good sense to learn the territory's specific medical challenges before he tried to treat them. A second general store opened, which finally gave Aldous Briggs actual competition and improved the prices for everyone. In 1882, Grace had a daughter, and they named her Me, and she was born in the spring as James had been, and from her first days she had her mother's directness and her father's stubborn refusal to give ground, which Owen said was going to be a considerable challenge, and Grace said was exactly what she had hoped for. Samuel, by this time 10 years old and rapidly becoming the person he was going to be, thoughtful and dry-humored and quietly capable, took his sister with the same devoted seriousness he had given his brother, and James, at 2, was extremely interested in me and expressed this interest by examining her with great thoroughness whenever the opportunity arose. One evening in the summer of 1882, when James was asleep, and me was nursed and sleeping, and Samuel was reading by the lamp, Owen and Grace sat on the porch together in the long summer dark, the way they had sat on the porch steps that very first winter, except that they were in proper chairs now and the porch was wider, and had a roof over it that Owen had built the previous spring. The valley was loud with summer frogs from the creek, the soft sound of the cattle in the lower pasture, a nighthawk somewhere high overhead, cutting its jagged line through the sky. "I have been thinking," Owen said. "You have that look," Grace said. "The one where you have been looking at the land and doing things in your head." "The south pasture drainage," he said. She laughed. "Of course, it has never been right. I think if we cut a channel from the low corner down to the creek draw another aqueduct," she said. "A drainage channel," he said, "opposite purpose." "But the same principle," she said. "The same principle," he agreed. She turned to look at him, and he turned to look at her, and she looked the way she had always looked to him. The dark eyes and the particular warmth in them when they rested on him, the jaw that had set itself in composure and learned to open, the face that had become the most specific thing in his world. She was 31 now, and she was more beautiful to him than she had been when they met, which he would not have predicted in theory but which was simply true. "Owen Hayes," she said, "you came down off a mountain and changed my life." "You changed mine first," he said. "I just did not realize it was happening." She smiled and reached across and took his hand, and they sat in the summer evening in companionable silence with their children sleeping inside and the valley alive around them, and the spring running clean and cold in its channel from the mountain to the basin, where the water arrived, steady and reliable and present, the way he had arrived and stayed. In the years that would follow, the story of the aqueduct would be repeated in Harlan Creek, with the particular embellishment that stories collect when they pass through enough voices. How the mountain man had come down in the worst winter in memory, and built a water system over a weekend that was still running 20 years later. How the widow had gone down the hill to chop ice one morning and come back up with a husband. The story made people happy, the way certain kinds of stories do, the kind that involve a right person arriving at the right time and doing something practical, and finding that the practical thing was also the beginning of everything else. The aqueduct did run for 20 years and more. Owen maintained it each autumn before the freeze and checked it each spring after the thaw, and he added improvements over time. A more robust intake system in 1884, when the original iron pipe corroded. A second channel from a higher seep he found in 1887 that doubled the flow in dry summers. A proper stone cistern attached to the cabin in 1890, when Harlan Creek's expansion finally made skilled masonry available to the valley. In 1890, Montana achieved statehood, and Harlan Creek celebrated with a day of public gathering that included a great deal of Aldous Briggs's whiskey, less watered down than it had once been, because Briggs had learned over the years that some reputations were not worth protecting at the cost of your neighbor's goodwill, and a roasted steer that Pete Vasquez organized with his characteristic confidence, and speeches from various local men who had strong opinions about the future of the state. Owen did not give a speech. He stood with Grace at the edge of the gathering, Samuel beside them, now a strapping 18-year-old who was taller than most men in the valley, and who had his mother's eyes and his stepfather's shoulders, and James at 10 running with the pack of valley children, and me at 8 doing something complicated with some other girls that involved a great deal of whispered conference and occasional dramatic gestures. "Happy," Grace said. He looked at the valley, at the families gathered in the summer light, at his children and his wife, and the life that had grown from a winter morning on a mountain ridge. "Yes," he said, and it was the simplest and most complete answer he had ever given. Samuel went off to study engineering in Helena in the fall of 1891, because Owen had noticed early that the boy had an instinctive understanding of how things were built and how water moved and how structures bore weight, and had encouraged it, and it had grown into something real. And he left the valley with a long handshake for Owen and a long hug for Grace, and a promise to write that he actually kept, sending letters with the careful regularity of someone who understood that keeping your word about small things was how you kept it about large ones. He came back in the summers and sometimes at Christmas, and the homestead expanded to accommodate him without difficulty, because Owen had built the cabin's addition with extra rooms and Grace had kept 2 of them with a permanence that she did not explain, but that he understood. James, who at 12 had declared his intention to ranch and had been pursued with complete single-mindedness, took on the cattle management of the Hayes homestead at 16 with a confidence that surprised even Owen, who had expected it. He had his grandfather Thomas Harper's stubbornness and his father's ability to read land, and he turned out cattle at a quality that got the Hayes brand recognized at the Helena market by the time he was 18. Me, at 16, wrote poems that she kept in a notebook she did not show to anyone, and then occasionally left on the kitchen table by accident in a way that was not quite an accident. And Grace read them and told her that they were very good in a tone that meant she was not saying it just because she was her mother. And Owen read one over Grace's shoulder and looked at his daughter with new attention and said nothing about it to me, because she had not technically shown it to him. But he thought about it for a long time and eventually built a proper writing desk for her room without explaining why he was building it. And me came home from school and found it there and looked at her father for a long moment and then said, "Thank you, Papa," in a tone that covered a great deal more than those 3 words. In 1895, Samuel came home from Helena not alone, but with a young woman named Clara, a civil engineer's daughter who had been studying school teaching and who had, as far as Owen and Grace could determine on first meeting, both the intelligence and the patience of character to hold Samuel's attention indefinitely. They were married the following June, in the same church schoolhouse that had been replaced by a proper church in 1888, and Grace wore blue wool again because she said it was lucky. And Owen stood beside Samuel at the front of the church as Samuel had once stood beside him. And when he looked at Grace in the front row with me beside her and James on the aisle and Clara's family filling the opposite pews, he thought that this was how things were supposed to accumulate, one good thing upon another. The way water finds its level and fills the shape of its container. The night before Samuel's wedding, Owen and Grace sat on the porch as they had sat on 100 porches over 16 years of marriage, and the valley below them was full of the particular thick darkness of a June night, warm and humming. "He was 7 when you met him," Grace said. "He was 7 when I met you both," Owen said. "He told me I was a very large man." "You are a very large man," Grace said, amused. "He was not wrong," Owen said, which was what he had said on that morning on the ice, and Grace recognized it and smiled the smile that had lived in her eyes since that first winter and that he never took for granted. "Owen," she said, "that woman you were before you came down the mountain, the solitary one. What about him?" Owen said. "Do you miss him?" He thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about everything worth thinking about, with the full attention he had given to reading terrain and water courses and the load-bearing capacity of stone. "No," he said. "I carry everything worth keeping from those years, the way of reading land, the patience, the knowledge of the high country, but the loneliness, no, I do not miss that." "Good," she said, "because I would not know what to do with you if you did." He laughed, and it was the laugh that Grace still sometimes said surprised her, even after all these years, the full, genuine laugh of a man who did not produce it often and meant it completely when he did. She came and sat on the armrest of his chair, which was not entirely structural but held because his chair was built for that kind of thing, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder and they looked at the summer valley, and the stars coming out over the ridge, the same ridge he had crested that first morning with the cold white sky overhead and the woman below him on the ice, not knowing what he was riding toward. only knowing that something had shifted in his chest and that he could not keep riding past it. The spring still ran. The channel still carried its water from the mountain to the basin. Every morning, clean and cold and present, the way he had always tried to be there and reliable and built to last. He had come down from the mountain once. He had never gone back to stay. And every morning when he watched the water arrive, clear and steady, following the path he had made for it through the stone and the frozen earth of a January weekend that had changed everything, he thought that this was the truest thing he had ever built. Not the channel and not the cabin and not the careful stone walls of the basin that still held after all these years. But this life, this fullness. This woman whose hand he held in the summer dark while the valley breathed around them and their children slept and the water ran and would keep running long after they were gone from the world that they had made together from a cold morning on the ice and 2 iron-banded buckets, and a mountain man who had looked down from a ridge and seen something he could not ride past. He had not been a man who believed in providence. He was a practical man, a man of tools and grade and measurement and correct technique. He believed in the things you could test with your hands and verify with your eyes. But on the long list of things he could not fully explain, the morning he had crested that ridge was at the top, and he had long since made his peace with not explaining it. Some things you simply accepted, the way you accepted the grade of a hillside and worked with it rather than against it, because working with the slope of things was how the water moved, and the water moving was how everything else became possible. Grace's hand tightened in his, the way it did sometimes in the evenings, and he looked at her profile in the summer dark, the line of her jaw and the curve of her smile, and he thought, there it is. There is the whole of it, here. He held on, and the summer night held on around them, warm and full and complete. The way endings are when they are not really endings at all, but simply the part of the story where you know it is going to be all right, and better than all right, and that the water is going to keep coming down the mountain for as long as you need it, clear and cold and true.